My Tomorrow, Your Yesterday. Written by Jason Ayres. Narrated by Paul Messingham. Epilogue. Death. January 2025. I awoke slowly, not knowing where I was, or even who I was. There was a dull, aching pain in my chest, and I felt incredibly woozy. I didn't know it at the time, but this was from the large dosage of morphine coursing through the veins of my weak and failing body. As I struggled to open my eyes, I heard a female voice. "He's coming round," it said. My heavy eyelids opened, and I saw the light blue overall of a nurse leaning over me. Looking around me, I could see at once that I was in a hospital room. The walls were pale and looked grubby, despite being scrubbed down on a regular basis. I could hear the regular beep of a machine next to me, which I realized was the sound of my heartbeat. In fact, there were several machines all around me. To my right was a small bedside table, upon which there was a glass vase full of fresh red roses. A clock with a black LCD display on a light background read 10:36 p.m. I tried to move, but it only caused me pain. As I did so, I became aware that I had all sorts of wires and tubes sticking into me, restricting my movement. There was tinsel draped across the window frame. The curtains were drawn with only a small gap between them, just enough for me to see that it was night time. A cheap-looking plastic Christmas tree stood in the far left corner of the room, its small points of white light blinking on and off, almost in time with my heartbeat from the machine. There was a large gold star sitting slightly lopsided on top. I felt a hand holding mine, and looked up to see the face of a beautiful young blonde woman looking down at me. There was no disguising the sadness in her pretty blue eyes. "Happy New Year, Dad," she said. "It won't be long now," said the nurse. An older, Hispanic-looking woman with olive skin and her hair tied up in a bun. "I'll leave you two alone." I struggled to gather my thoughts. The blonde woman had called me Dad, so she must be my daughter. But I couldn't recall her name. I didn't even recognize her. I couldn't remember anything about anything. I knew that I was in a hospital, and I knew that the nurse was Spanish in origin. I knew it must be the festive season. So I knew what things were, but none of the detail. It was like joining a movie halfway through, where I could see what was happening, but didn't know what was happening, or who any of the characters were. It was all very confusing. Perhaps it was the pain-killing drugs they'd given me. Clearly I was very ill. Was this it then? Was I destined to die without even any comforting thoughts and memories from my life to ease my passage out of this world? What had the nurse said? "It won't be long now." That didn't bode well. I struggled weakly to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was pain in my throat. The blonde woman saw me struggling to speak and squeezed my hand tighter. "It's okay, Dad," she said. I gazed into her wide blue eyes, tinged with the tears she was struggling to hold back as she spoke again. I was finding it difficult to stay awake. I had no idea what was happening, and all I wanted to do was drift off to sleep. I felt my eyelids begin to droop. "I love you, Dad," said the blonde woman. The last thing I saw was a single tear roll down her cheek and drip onto my hand, as my eyes closed for the final time. I heard the beep, beep, beep from the machine change to one continuous long beep as darkness descended in front of me. My final thought was, this isn't so bad. It's just like going to sleep. Chapter 1. Cancer. December 2024. I awoke with a start. The same nurse I'd seen the day before was drawing back the curtains, letting shafts of bright sunlight pour into the room. Little points of dust twinkled in the sunbeams coming through the window, in front of a piercingly bright blue sky beyond, unbroken except for a flock of starlings circling back and forth in the distance. The light was so bright it hurt my eyes. So, I wasn't dead then. That wasn't difficult to work out. I didn't feel as bad as I had the previous morning. I could still feel the dull ache in my chest, and all the wires and tubes were still there, but I felt a little more with it than I had the last time I'd woken up. Was I getting better? The nurse turned towards me and spoke. "How are you feeling this morning, Mr. Scott?" she asked. I managed to croak a reply. "A little better, thank you," struggling to remember her name. As she came towards me to plump up my pillows, I caught sight of the badge on her uniform and quickly added, "Carmen?" "That's good," she said. "Your daughter's coming in to see you later. It looks like it's going to be a lovely sunny day." As the nurse left the room, I managed to sit up a little, which wasn't easy with all the bits attached to me, and pondered my situation. I still felt very weak, but my mind was a little clearer now. My eyesight was a little blurry, but I could see enough to make out my general surroundings. It was a private room with its own bathroom in the corner, a flat-screen television embedded in one wall, and a cosy-looking sofa and chairs in the far left-hand corner. Pretty good by NHS standards, assuming this was an NHS hospital. There was no obvious way of knowing. So, I knew what the NHS was, that I was in a hospital and that I was clearly very ill. I knew my name was Mr. Scott, but that was only because the nurse had addressed me as such. I'd no idea what my first name was. I also knew I had a daughter, about whom I knew nothing other than what I'd learnt during our brief interaction the previous day. And that was not a lot. The nurse came back into the room and helped me to sit up. "Do you feel up to any breakfast?" she asked. "The trolley's here." "I'll try," I replied, but I didn't feel very hungry. With her assistance, I sat up and managed to take a few sips of orange juice, but I didn't fancy any food. I was feeling pretty nauseous and felt sure I would bring anything up that I might try to eat. "Would you like to watch television?" asked Carmen. "Please," I croaked weakly. I didn't think the TV was going to shed any more light on my situation, but it would be a distraction at least. The nurse propped up my pillows behind me, allowing me to sit up, and flicked on the TV. It was showing the rolling news channel which was reporting on some conflict in the Middle East I knew nothing about. The country names were familiar to me, but that was all. The screen switched to an image of London, showing a scene I instantly recognised, the familiar backdrop of Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament. I listened intently to what was being said. "Preparations are underway in London for tonight's New Year's Eve spectacular, which promises to be the biggest and the best ever. The Mayor said that the increased sales from tickets this year meant that an additional £250,000 was being spent on the fireworks display, which he boldly claimed would be the best in the world." Now I was starting to feel a little confused. What was wrong with my memory? I was sure that my daughter had wished me a Happy New Year the previous day. So how could today be New Year's Eve? Whatever my illness was, it was playing tricks with my mind. Perhaps I had dementia. The effort of thinking about it all was making me tired, and I lay back down on the bed. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I can remember is that my daughter was sitting once again by the bed. I was feeling pretty awful now, a gnawing, agonising pain eating away at the inside of my chest. The clear sky beyond the window had turned a darker shade of blue as night began to fall. The clock on the bedside table read 3:58 p.m. "How are you feeling, Dad?" she asked. I struggled to speak through the pain. "Not too good, my love," was about all I could muster. I couldn't call her by her name, because I still didn't know what it was. "Do you want me to call the nurse?" she asked. "Please," I croaked. "I'm in pain." She pressed a red button on the wall behind me, and Carmen returned to the room. "He's really suffering," said my daughter. "Is there anything you can do?" "I'll have to get the doctor," replied Carmen. While she was gone, I decided it was time to try and find out what was happening. Honey, I'm struggling with my memory. I can't seem to remember anything. Why am I here? I asked, hoping that honey was an okay word to use. Oh, Dad, she said, fighting back the tears. You're very poorly, but it's okay, don't worry. I'm here for you. I won't leave you. Am I going to die? I asked. She didn't reply, but just squeezed my hand. The pain in my chest was becoming unbearable, so it was just as well that Carmen returned with the doctor, a slim young man with curly black hair, wearing the white coat that instantly identified his profession. The three of them consulted between them. I felt my eyelids growing heavy once again. Mr. Scott, I'm going to increase your medication again, said the doctor. It's important that we manage your pain as best we can at this stage. I nodded weakly in agreement, and he adjusted a dial on the side of one of the clear plastic pouches that was suspended from one of the many pieces of equipment wired into me. Relief gradually came to me, but with it I became increasingly drowsy. I could hear my daughter whispering words of comfort to me, but she sounded very far away. Before long I drifted away into a morphine-induced slumber. The next time I awoke, I felt a little better. The pain still lingered in my chest and I remained tired, but I didn't feel at all woozy from the additional medication that the doctor had given me. I also became aware that I was no longer attached to the machines, and managed to sit up properly this time. There was no one in the room, and in my upright position I could get a proper look around the room for the first time. It was daylight outside, and a steady drizzle was falling against leaden grey skies. I turned to the bedside cabinet upon which sat the digital clock I'd seen before. It was showing not just the time, but various other bits of information too. From this I was able to ascertain that it was 9:12 a.m. on the 30th of December, 2024, and that the temperature in the room was 21.7 degrees Celsius. The figures looked blurry, but next to the clock was a blue glasses case which I opened to find a pair of expensive, designer-looking glasses, presumably mine. They must have been, because when I put them on, my vision improved considerably. The clock must be wrong. How could it be December 30th, when it had been New Year's Eve yesterday? Leaving aside the confusion over the date for the moment, I sat up and opened the top of 2 drawers in the cabinet. Inside I found a wallet and a mobile phone. The glasses had been mine, so it was fair to assume these were too, even though I couldn't recall ever seeing either before. This was distinctly weird. I felt as if I was rooting through a stranger's possessions, but clearly they could only be my own. I still couldn't remember anything else about my life. Whatever was causing this amnesia, it wasn't getting any better. I picked up the wallet. It was a light tan colour of leather, held together by a button which I popped open to look inside. There were cards stuffed into both sides of the wallet. The left-hand side had a clear plastic panel displaying a small pink card that I instinctively knew was my driving licence. As I looked at the face of the stranger on the front, I realised with a shock that I didn't even know what I looked like. Looking back at me was the picture of a middle-aged, slightly overweight man with glasses and a mop of untidy, thinning dark hair on top. I pulled the licence out of the sleeve and looked for more details. From this I learned that my name was Thomas Scott, and I'd been born on 21st of October, 1970. So that made me 54 years old, presuming the date on the clock was correct. It didn't seem like much of an age to be in hospital, at death's door. What had I done to myself to get into this state? The licence also held my address, which informed me that I lived in Oxford. I had some general concept of Oxford in my mind. I could picture it on a map and envisage the town centre, but the address meant nothing to me. It was odd that I could remember fairly generic things, but nothing personal to myself. I flicked through the rest of the wallet, but I didn't learn a lot more about myself, other than that I banked with Barclays, had a Nectar card, an Oyster card, 2 credit cards, and about £80 in cash. I also found an intriguing picture of a woman who reminded me of my daughter, but she looked older, perhaps late 30s. Whoever she was, I had no recollection of her. Next, I picked up the smartphone. It was a highly technological piece of kit, no more than about 4 inches long and as slim as a credit card. It looked incredibly flimsy, but was made of some incredible strong and light material. Unfortunately, my attempts to find out more information got no further than the front screen, which demanded a 4-number PIN. I'd no idea what it was. I tried 2110 and 1970, going by the date of birth on my driving licence, but neither of those was right, so I gave up and put it back in the drawer. I felt desperate for a wee, so I decided to get out of bed and walk across to the bathroom. I felt extremely unsteady and weak on my feet, like a frail old man. When I got to the bathroom, I managed to urinate with some discomfort, and then hobbled across to the sink, above which there was a large rectangular mirror. For the second time that morning, I was shocked by my appearance. I looked nothing like the man in the photograph on my driving licence. My hair was all but gone, other than a few grey wisps. My gaunt and drawn appearance looked back at me from a pair of bloodshot eyes, heavy with dark circles beneath them. To say I looked at death's door would have been an understatement. I needed some answers and, almost on cue, a nurse came into the room. It wasn't Carmen this time, but a younger woman, blonde and, to my eye, weak with illness though I was, quite attractive. "Good morning, Thomas," she said. "It's good to see you up and about." She spoke in a gorgeous, sexy Liverpool accent. Had I not been feeling so dismal, I could have quite fancied her. But there were well and truly no stirrings down below. I looked at her name badge, trying not to make it look as if I was ogling her quite ample breasts, and saw that her name was Amy. "Well, at least I'm not wired up to all those machines anymore," I replied. "You never were," she said. "Well, you weren't yesterday anyway." She had a friendly, bubbly way about her, to which I instantly warmed. This was the opportunity I'd been looking for, to try and shed a little more light on the situation. I headed back into the room and sat down on the bed. "Yes, well, now you come to mention it," I began. "I seem to be suffering from a bit of memory loss. I can't really remember much about why I'm here, or what's wrong with me," I said. "That's odd," she said. "Amnesia isn't something we normally get with cancer patients. The doctor will be round in a bit. Perhaps you should mention it to him." When she said the C word, it was as if someone had plunged a dagger right into my chest. So that was why I was here. Deep down, I'd already suspected as much. But it still hit home with devastating force. "What type of cancer is it?" I asked, full of trepidation. There was no good kind, but the answer that came back was the worst possible one it could have been. "It's lung cancer," she said, her jovial tone becoming more serious for a moment. "I'm so sorry. You really don't remember, do you?" So, that was that. The most fatal cancer of them all. I was pretty sure that few people survived it. What had I done to get lung cancer? Was it down to smoking? I had no idea. Perhaps I could find out more from my daughter. I really needed to find out more about her. Her name would be a good start. "Listen, Amy," I said, "can you help me out a little here? My daughter was here yesterday, and I think she might be coming in again today. This is really embarrassing, and I don't want to upset her, but I can't even remember her name. Do you know it?" "It's Stacy," replied the nurse. "You were telling me all about her yesterday." Yesterday, I thought. Now there was a word to conjure with. When was yesterday? As far as I was concerned, I'd never seen Amy before today, and it had been Carmen who had tended to me yesterday. "Thank you," I replied. "I will speak to the doctor about my amnesia. That's if I can remember any of this by the time he gets here," I joked. Even though I was facing death, I could still find some dark humour in my situation. Amy offered me some breakfast, and I managed to eat a little cereal with milk and sugar, and drink some orange juice. Soon after, I felt lousy, so I lay back down and thought about things. When Stacey came in, I'd talk to her and try to make sense of my situation. I didn't have long to wait, as I soon drifted off to sleep. When I awoke, she was sitting by my side. She smiled at me, her face not quite so desperately sad as it had been the last time I'd seen her. Maybe she was putting a brave face on things, for my sake. "Thank you for coming to see me," I said, hoping that didn't sound too formal. I tried to remind myself that this was my daughter, who presumably I loved more than anyone else in the world. But it was difficult to feel emotion for someone I barely knew. I wondered where her mother was. Perhaps we were divorced. "Dad, I'm going to be right here every day, as long as you need me, like I promised," she replied. "Stacey," I began, able to use her name at last. "I don't know if it's the illness, but I'm having a little trouble remembering things. Can I ask you a few questions? I know some of the answers may be a little obvious, but my mind seems to be playing tricks with me." "Of course, Dad. Ask away." "Well, the first thing is that I seem to be losing track of the days. Can you remind me what day it is?" "That's quite understandable," she replied. "I always lose track of the days over Christmas." "It's Monday." "So what does that make the date?" I asked. "Have we had New Year yet?" "It's December the 30th, she replied. "2 more days to go. Remember, you promised you'd be here to see the New Year in with me. Don't let me down now." So the clock was right. How long had I been here? Could it have been a whole year? Was my memory of her wishing me a Happy New Year in this very room not a couple of days ago, but from the previous January? Surely I couldn't have been here that long, could I? My head swam with all the questions I wanted to ask her. "So how long have I been here?" was the obvious next question for me to ask. "I brought you in on Boxing Day, remember? You wanted to stay at home, but you were in so much pain, I didn't think I had any choice." Her face clouded over at what was clearly an unpleasant memory. "I wasn't here last New Year then," I replied. "You didn't even know you were ill this time last year." "It's all happened so quickly," she sighed. "If only you had gone to the doctor sooner, but you were so stubborn about it." The whole New Year, not New Year conundrum continued to perplex me, but I put that aside for the time being as I continued to question her about what had happened to me. It turned out I'd been ill and coughing for weeks and weeks before Stacey finally frog-marched me to visit the doctor in November. From there, the diagnosis of advanced and incurable lung cancer was swift and brutal. I was given 3 months to live. It seemed I hadn't even managed 2 months. So much for putting up a brave fight then. It seemed as if I'd gone down like a punch-drunk boxer. I really needed to find out more about my life, so I decided to steer the conversation away from all the doom and gloom. "Let's talk about happier times, shall we?" I said. "I'm a little tired. Tell me some nice stories about your childhood, and what you remember about me from when you were growing up." This seemed the best way to ask, without letting on that I remembered nothing about it whatsoever. By asking questions in the right places, nodding and agreeing when she asked, "Do you remember when?" I managed to piece together a very flimsy framework of my life. Stacey was my only child, and she was 25 years old. Her mother, and my wife, had died 7 years ago in a car crash, so that explained her absence from the bedside. I didn't learn her name, but I did deduce that the photograph I'd found earlier in my wallet must have been of her. I'd worked my whole life in the retail trade, starting in shops when I was younger and progressing to the head office of a major national chain of supermarkets. It seemed we had been pretty well off, judging by Stacey's recollections of some of our holidays abroad, which included Florida and Dubai. Stacey herself was living with a man in London who worked in the media, having left home some time after she had finished university. She'd returned home recently to care for me. All the questions and the conversation had exhausted me, leaving my cancer-stricken body crying out for rest. I wanted to find out more, but later that afternoon, I found myself once again suffering agonizing pain. In front of my daughter's sorrowful gaze, I was once again placed under sedation. 4 more similar days passed, and then I awoke in unfamiliar surroundings. So this was it then. I was back at home, as I had suspected I might be. Over the past few days, I'd watched the clock slip back a day each time, from the 29th to the 28th to the 27th. Each morning as I had awoken in the hospital, I'd spoken to the nurses and also to my daughter when she visited. Each time they had no recollection of what had occurred on the previous day, or at least not as I recalled it. Unless this was some enormous and elaborate practical joke that someone was playing on me, there was no denying that time was running backwards. Being laid up in the hospital had left me with plenty of time to think. It helped to take my mind off the never-ending pain inside me, which no amount of morphine could completely take away. On the 27th, I tried to get it all clear in my mind, exactly what the situation was, and wrote it down on a notepad that I'd found in one of the drawers next to my hospital bed. The key points seemed to be as follows. 1. Time was running backwards for me on a day-by-day basis. If it was Friday today, then tomorrow it would be Saturday for everybody else, but Thursday for me. 2. Time ran as normal during the day itself. The exact point when I jumped back was sometime during the night, but I wasn't exactly sure when. 3. Each jump back must be exactly 48 hours. Otherwise I'd be living the same day over and over again. 4. I had no memory of my past life, but fully understood the world around me. Stacey had a clear memory of my past, which did not seem in any way unusual to her. Everything seemed to be running normally for everybody else. 5. Based on Stacey's anecdotes about the past, I concluded that I must have already lived my life in full, right up until the day I died. Now, for whatever reason, I was starting to live it over again, but backwards. Those were the facts as far as I had managed to ascertain them, but they still left a huge number of unanswered questions. Firstly, was the past fixed? If Stacey told me I'd done certain things on a certain day, was I destined to do those things again, or could I change them? I had not had a chance to test this theory out yet, but now that I was back at home, surely I could. And if I made changes, what effect would they have? The biggest question of all was, why? To that I had no answer, but it seemed that I was being given a second shot at life, and one that intrigued me. I needed to find out as much as I could about not only my own past life, but also everything that was happening in the wider world. As I'd already worked out, I had a basic working knowledge of how the world worked, but without the detail. For example, I could point to a country on a map and say, yes, that's the USA, and they have a president, whilst we have a prime minister. But I wouldn't be able to tell you the name of that president or any of his predecessors. These were all things that I was going to have to find out. I vowed to read as much as I could in the newspapers and online, as well as devouring as many history books and television programs as I could get my hands on. I had a lot to learn if I was going to make the most of this unique opportunity. But now I had Boxing Day to get through. It was a relief to be out of the hospital, but I was grimly aware that later in the day I was going to be suffering so badly that my daughter would be taking me in. It wasn't a pleasant thought, and I couldn't see any way around it. Having spent most of the past few days in various degrees of excruciating agony, I steeled myself for the worst. The only comforting thought I had was that if time continued to run backwards, then I should get progressively better as I moved back through December. It was time to explore my home. I reflected for a moment on the peculiarity that, although this was my first day in my new home, in another way it was also my last. I sat up and looked around the room. Although the details were unfamiliar to me, the pale cream decor, the dark blue curtains and the chest of drawers, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. I got up to go to the bathroom, which I instinctively knew was through the door opposite my bedroom. I paused to examine the chest of drawers as I passed. It contained various male grooming items, some family photos, a digital radio, and 1 or 2 ornaments. None of these things really told me anything new. It was interesting that I knew my way around the house. There was a definite familiarity about my immediate surroundings. Just as with my wider knowledge of the world, I had the broad knowledge of the structure, but not the detail. It was as if I'd put together all 4 sides of a jigsaw puzzle, but none of the pieces in the middle. I knew where the bathroom, kitchen and living room were, but as far as my memory was concerned, they were empty rooms, devoid of memories. I still felt as rough as anything as I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, but nowhere near as bad as I had in the hospital mirror a few days ago. It looked like I'd gone downhill pretty fast between Christmas and New Year. At least my death had been mercifully swift. I really hoped that my travelling backwards through time was a permanent arrangement. I certainly wouldn't want to have to face the misery of that last week over again. I shuddered at the thought. To say it had not been pleasant would have been an understatement. I managed to go to the toilet, wash my face and brush my teeth. But as I rinsed, a horrible, hacking cough began, leaving me bent over almost double in pain. I felt as if I was coughing up what was left of my rotten lungs, and it brought my daughter running to the room in concern. Fortunately, the attack soon passed, and with her help I was able to dress and go downstairs to enjoy what was left of the day, before what seemed an unavoidable journey to the hospital. Whatever else I might have the power to change, at this stage of my life my fate was sealed. When I awoke the next day, it was a relief to wake up once again back in my own bed at home. As I had predicted, by Boxing Day evening I'd found myself in the hospital, after an agonising afternoon of pain which even the ministrations of a visiting Macmillan nurse had been unable to relieve. From the information I'd gathered from Stacey, I was pretty sure that from now on things ought to get better. I had not had to stay in hospital before Christmas, and despite having been confined at home for the past month, the pain management given to me had enabled me to live a semi-normal life. The time I had at home now would give me the opportunity to plan for my future, all of which seemed destined to take place in the past,